my pleasure to welcome you to Revolutions in Science and Technology Paradigms, the first EIU Technology and Science Symposium. And we are delighted today to have Dr. Bonnie Irwin, the Dean of our own EIU Arts and Humanities. But I know her from other aspects as well. I well remember the first year I came here, and she was the faculty laureate at the time.
Mm-hmm.
So that was my first encounter. Who is she? She is Bonnie Irwin. And soon after that, I was putting the symposium for our centennial for School of Technology, and the symposium topic was Technology and Us. And I have never seen a person who can take a pen like this and speak for 45 minutes, non-stop beef talk. And the attention of the audience was amazing. And I still remember this presentation. And I just told her this time, she has always been in the symposium. She say, I can say no. And she comes and she delivers. And I told her this a couple of weeks ago or so, told her if I find another Bonnie Irwin that can do this, I would have invited her, but there's only one Bonnie Irwin, and she is here. Here's your pen.
Thank you.
That's the same pen.
Yeah.
Probably, right? And I'm going to talk about this again today in a minute. But I agreed today to talk about the way technology has influenced literature, and not just how we consume literature, but how we produce it. And for me, the technology is not going to be like any of the technology that you're hearing about through the rest of the symposium, because for me, the most important piece of technology, or the most important development technology that we have ever had, is the development of writing. And one could argue that the wheel might also be, significant, but almost nothing else that's being presented in this symposium is possible without writing. And writing is a technology. If you look at the root of the word technology, techne meaning a craft, and logos meaning words, right? So it is the craft of putting words together. And Wafik is right. The last time I spoke on a similar subject, I just held up a pen and sort of waxed poetic about the technology of writing and how it has changed the way we think, the way we operate, and everything else. Today, though, I'm going to try to expand it and cover a little bit more ground, because the evolution of literature goes through oral verbal art, to written verbal art, to printed verbal art, to now the internet, right? All of these devices. And it's not just how we read the literature, it's how the literature is produced, what it allows us to do in terms of storytelling, that I think is really fascinating. But I'm going to start a slightly different place, because since I last spoke about this topic on this campus, one of my mentors, the late John Foley, published a book and has a website out there right now called Pathways of the Mind, where he compares the oral traditional world, when people would do everything by way of speaking in pre-literate societies, to the age of the internet. And if we think about one of the concepts he lays out early in his work is this idea of the Homo sapiens year. If we assume that human beings have been on the planet in some form, the species Homo sapien, for about 100,000 years, and that's really conservative, but if we start there, and then we map that 100,000 year period over a calendar year, all right, that makes sense. So 100,000 years, but we're going to look at it as if it were 12 months. When do you think writing would come in those 12 months?
That's you second.
It's actually in December. So, right? So if we think about all of human life, or all of Homo sapiens life, numeracy actually beats literacy. It comes in about November 22nd. So just in time for Thanksgiving, we can count, I guess. The Egyptian scripts start coming in at the equivalent of about December the 10th. Okay? The Greek alphabet, about December the 19th. All right, so if you think about all of human existence, and we couldn't write until halfway through December. That is just incredible. The printing press takes us to December the 27th in this Homo sapiens year. So in all of human history, or all of human existence rather, the word history is a little loaded in this context, we've only had print for 4 days. And then if we leap ahead one more time and talk about the internet, it is now 11:44 on December 31st, right? It's almost midnight by the time we actually have the internet. Now, obviously, centuries from now, those dates are going to shift a little bit. But I think it's a great way of thinking about this whole idea of how important writing was, because everything we think about in history and in science that has been enabled by writing doesn't happen until human beings have been around for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. So that's just sort of to lay the groundwork there, because I found that absolutely fascinating, so I just had to share that one. The typewriter, by the way, comes in around December 31st at noon. So have that for a whole half a day. So when we start thinking about how literature or verbal art, because literature literally means it was written, right? So if we talk about what we would call verbal art before the invention of writing, we try to use that word verbal art rather than literature. But if we think about what that was before people could actually write it down, the kinds of stories that were told, they tended to be iterative. Not repetitive so much, but it would come back in different forms and there would be some repetition in it, because if you think about something like Homer's Iliad, some 11,000 lines, none of it was written down when it was created and performed. And so poets had to be really well trained and they had to have ways of remembering things. And so words stood for more than just what a word is. As a matter of fact, this whole concept of a word before writing isn't there. I mean, people spoke, but the idea of dividing that into discrete words like we do when we put them on paper didn't exist. So there are phrases, there are images, it's very formulaic, so it happens the same way. The two scholars that discovered this, and I always have to laugh on this campus now because their names were Milman Parry and Albert Lord. And so whenever I hear our president and provost referred to, I think of Parry and Lord, the scholars, first. Now Parry spelled his name differently, but still in all. And the way they discovered how this worked, how these ancient literatures, particularly poetry, worked, was that they studied modern poetry in Yugoslavia, where it was a non-literate tradition. People weren't writing it down, and they were telling these epic tales of the history without any written versions. And so they studied them, and then they interviewed these poets. And the poet would tell you, oh no, I performed it exactly the same way tonight as I did last night. But of course, they were taping them. And so once you tape it and transcribe it, you realize that there are pretty significant differences. The other thing that a poet could do is change. So if your audience is bored, or if your audience wants more battle scenes, and they were very vocal, they would tell you exactly what they wanted, you could change the story. You could add another piece about a particular hero if that hero's relatives, descendants from hundreds of years ago were in the audience, right? You would, because these poets are trying to make a living too. And so you would craft your text. And so what's really exciting about that oral verbal art is it was alive. It was changing all the time. But it was still at the same time very conservative, because you're not going to make up a bunch of new stuff if you have to remember it. Now we think that before writing, memories were much better. One of the other things that writing does to us is it sort of destroys our memories because we don't need them anymore. Well, I mean, we need some, but not nearly as much as they did before that. So the oral tradition is very much alive. Literary tradition, though, is quite static. You write it down, and it's done. You write your story down, and here's the version of the story, and this is what it is. So if you look at a play by Shakespeare, it's always the same. You can perform it differently, but the words are not going to change. And that's when we get into different editions, and if we look at translations and versions of things, yes, but each artifact is static. And if you think about literacy and literature, of the thousands of languages that have existed over time, really only just over 100 had enough writing to produce literature. And the last time someone made a formal count that I am aware of, a scholar by the name of Jack Goody, he's an anthropologist, in the early 70s, there were over 300 living languages at that time. There are probably fewer today because several of them have died. But only 78 had literature. So again, it's sort of an interesting dynamic. 3,000 languages, only 78 with any kind of creative literary tradition. When writing is developed, it's developed first for business reasons. So in some ways, capitalism predates literature because the first things that were written down were contracts, leases, records of sales, that kind of thing. But then they started writing other things, and when they start writing things that of literary production, it changes things quite a bit. So what does writing bring with it? Well, Jack Goody, again, the anthropologist, and Walter Ong, who's a great scholar of that transfer from oral tradition to literary tradition, talk about a few things. One of them is skepticism, that non-literate traditional societies were not skeptical. Because you have to be able to write things down to really analyze them and think about them in a way that if you're keeping so much other knowledge in your head, you can't be skeptical. You can be somewhat analytic, but you can't evaluate the way we do today. So that is a huge change. The other thing that comes about with writing that's not really literary are lists. And once you have a list, you can start classifying things. I mean, the whole notion of the library, right, is built on this idea of being able to classify knowledge in different categories. None of that is there without writing. And that's why I will argue that writing is not only one of the very earliest technologies, but also one of the most important, because without classification and taxonomies, we have no science, and skepticism as well, right? All of that sort of science comes out of this notion of being able to write things down. And texts, though, are limited. They're finite. So on the one hand, writing opens up thought. You can think about more things, but then once you commit it to writing, it's static again. It doesn't change. But then you have to write more to get the ideas to progress. So the other thing that happens, and somewhat related to the last presentation you heard, is literature is no longer an oral. We don't listen to literature anymore, we see it. So it's a whole different experience to see a story than to hear a story. Physiologically, it's an entirely different process. And so what happens when we have writing? Stories get longer in some cases. But in the earliest days of writing, we're still really conservative because, and again, I know you all know this, but we had in the Near East, we had papyrus, and in Egypt, we had papyrus, right? And that's not really easy to produce. You're putting those reeds down, you're pounding them down, you're rolling them out. And then in Europe, they were using vellum, which was created from the hide of lamb, I believe. But again, it's an animal skin. Again, you don't have a whole lot of this lying around. The Chinese, of course, invented paper. That helps tremendously. But in the early days of literacy, it was a precious commodity. So we see things written in stone, we see them written on papyrus, we see them written in clay, but you can't write a lot when you're working with those materials, and you can't write fast. So fast forward to the Middle Ages, they're writing more, there's more vellum available, we start bringing paper into the picture, but still most of the writing is done in monasteries. Monks, the Bible is a perfect sample of this. They would just recopy it slowly, tediously, one copy at a time. And so for any given book, only the very, very wealthy had books. And typically only the very, very wealthy could read and write anyway. And not all of them could. Some of them just had these pretty books on the shelves that they couldn't read. The scribes, the clergy could read. And they're responsible for a lot of the transfer of literature from one language to another, one country to another. So we have more abstract thought, we have more sophistication of thought, we have more sophistication in the way stories are told, but the texts are still very static because an individual text doesn't change. And then along comes Gutenberg, right? So now we're in our human year, what did I say, December 27th, all the way almost to the end of the month when we have the printing press. So what does the printing press do for us? We can mass produce things. And yes, that means more people have access to reading materials, but it also means that more things get printed in the first place and more things get written because you can have multiple copies and you can actually establish a readership. This comes very slowly. But the other thing that happens once we have a printing press, and it actually predates the printing press a little bit, but this idea of what a book is. Because of course a book, as we understand a book, doesn't exist until you can put all the pages together in some kind of a format. Now this particular one is an edition of the first volume of the Arabian Nights, which of course is my favorite book. And this one is, an old school binding. It's sewn together. Right? You can tell that the pages had to have been cut because they were done in the quarto style. And I don't know a whole lot about the history of the book. I'm far more interested in what came before books. But this is a book. Now, by the time that this is produced in the 19th century, we do have some control over font size and formatting. But in the early days, it was very standardized. It was printed, but it was all the same. And so you weren't going to have headers and footers and footnotes and all of those things. So every time we've incorporated technology into the production of the written word, it enables us to do more with what it is that's written down. So by the 19th century, again, we've got things like footnotes, which you don't have when someone's writing it on page. If you forgot something or if you make a major mistake, you're starting over. Or you're crossing it out. It depends, I think, on who you were preparing it for, whether you could actually cross it out or not. But we also see with ancient manuscripts, and I probably should have used some PowerPoint for this, that because there weren't very many copies, if you look at some of the old ones, like an old manuscript of a Homeric poem, when they finally did write the Iliad down, there are notes in the margins, right? Because that was the only way to keep track of certain things without creating a whole new book. I can't tell you the year that we really started in paperbacks and pulp fiction, but this is another version of the Arabian Nights, and as you can tell probably from the wear pattern, this is the first one I ever owned. A few things that this tells us. Well, these were started in the 20th century, right? Paperback books. Huge difference here, and I would argue it has a great impact on literature, is that we're using really cheap paper. Right? So in another 40 years, I may not be able to read this one. It's glued together, so it may not seem like a very sophisticated technology, but when you apply the technology of gluing to a book, it changes how you build the book, right? They no longer have to be sewn together in a cloth binding. You can glue it together, you can slap them together quickly and cheaply. So, and again, after you've had it for a while, though, they start to fall apart, because that glue does not hold nearly as well as a nice sewn binding does. But if you think about the middle of the 20th century and the whole growth of pulp fiction, the kinds of things that are now being published, it certainly doesn't have to be high art, right? So in some ways, the more technology, the worse the quality, because you can do it cheap. Now, I'm a great fan of that era. My husband and I read Perry Mason novels and a lot of those, because a lot of them were crime novels. That seemed to be something that people really like to read. But because you could produce them quickly, cheaply, they tend to be pretty short, and they're just glued together, they're all over the place. And the other name for them, of course, in the day was the dime novel. You could buy a book for a dime. Now, consider how that fits into the economy. I mean, it's not cheap when you think about, say, the 40s, but a book for a dime versus a book that took someone months to write down by hand with pen and ink. And so you're looking at a whole different way of producing and consuming the written word, which leads to any number of other developments. Okay. So it gets cheaper, it gets quicker, it gets more ubiquitous, more people have books, everyone can afford books, and when everyone has access, then the taste change as well. Because, yes, a lot of people still have high literature in their homes, but they also have a lot of this other stuff that is entertaining, but is not considered great art. Go that direction. So now, if we jump up to December 31st, quarter to midnight, we have the internet. And technology generally. What has technology done for the book and the way we think about books? So this book is both old school and new school because it's got a cloth binding and it's sewn. You can see the sort of lines here where it was sewn together. But this is a graphic novel. And before computers, these all had to be hand-drawn. They don't anymore. Now, I think a lot of this one was, actually, but you've got a whole different interaction with the text in a graphic novel. It's not, in early books, yes, you could have illustrations, you could have pictures, but words and pictures don't interact the way they do in a graphic novel. So this graphic novel, which draws upon the Arabian Nights in some ways, it takes place in the Middle East, makes us see the literature in a whole new way, because you're really looking at the illustrations in some ways even before the words. And the words come out in all different formats. I mean, there's more words and less words, there's dark pages, there's light pages. The fonts can change, you can shift their orientation. And all of this is manufactured by computer and manipulated on computer after it's drawn so that you can create a book. All right. So this is one giant leap forward, backwards, again, depending on what you think about the quality. And then, if we look at these things, right? Now, I didn't bring my Kindle. I prefer to read on a Kindle than an iPad, but, so here we've got text. This doesn't look any different than this. It's the same thing. But what this does for me is, for one thing, it helps my back, right? Because I have 150 or more books right here. I can read them the same way I read this one. It's not as fun to hold. It gets a little warm, or sometimes it's cold, depending on where it's been sitting. But the text is laid out the same. If we're looking at people with disabilities, you can create larger text, smaller text. So there's that advance, that we can read a book as if it were print on one of these devices. But then we've also got other things we can do. This is a book, and you can't see it really well across the room, but it is a book on this that is a compilation of cartoons, but the artist, the author, has interviews interspersed into it. It's still a book, I think, in terms of the fact that it's got a beginning and a middle and an end, and it tells a story as this tells a story, but our interaction with it changes. We've always had, well, we haven't always, but for many, many decades, we've had picture books for children where they could interact without being able to read, but this is a whole different thing. And the idea of the picture book and the interactive book is now an adult genre as well as a genre for children, so that changes things tremendously. So if I could go back to John Foley and his work comparing the oral world to the literary world. He uses the term agora, which in Greek means a marketplace of ideas, of text, and he talks about the agora, the oral agora, where stories were also more democratic. They belonged to a community. You would have certain very talented poets, but the story belonged to everybody. Things like copyright don't exist before writing, because I hear a story one night and I learn how to perform it, and a few weeks later it becomes mine and I can tell the story, and it really is owned by the whole community and not by any one individual. That's why most works of literary art from the oral tradition are anonymous. When we think about Homer, who knows if he ever existed, or if Homer is more representative of just a very long line of talented poets. Or maybe that particular one did exist and it was his version that somebody finally wrote down. I'm not really sure. But this idea of the democracy, the open marketplace of ideas and an exchange of ideas, and that people could change stories. So if I don't like the way you're telling a story, I could adapt it to my own use and tell it my way, and then it becomes mine. Literature and print eliminates that, because now all of a sudden a book, a work of literary art is owned by a person. Right? So William Butler Yeats wrote this poem and nobody disputes that, and if you put it in your research paper you have to cite that it was his words and not yours. Right? So it becomes more solitary. It also becomes more elitist because not everyone has access to publishing houses to get their work released and published. So it becomes a more elite enterprise. Now we go back to the idea of pulp fiction, it becomes a little less elite. But now when we have the internet, or as my mentor John would call the e-agora, the electronic marketplace, has really more in common than the pre-literate world than it does with the literate world. Yes, we're still dealing in words, but the way it works, if you think about the internet, and if you think about the really modern, cutting-edge literary ways in which the internet is being used, we take something, we build on it. The networks. So it becomes a system again, it becomes more democratic, and anybody can publish anything now. Again, for better or worse, right? But if I decide I want to write a novel, I can write one, I can slap it up on a blog, and anyone can have access to it. So it's a system rather than objects. What writing does and what print does is it turns the written word and the art of the written word into a thing. But before and after, it's a system. It's a network. You've got all of these interconnections, whereas a book, we connect with books, certainly. We write about books, we enjoy books, we read books, but we don't have the same interaction with the book as we do with the internet. And one of the things I find really interesting about this, and again, it may be the enemy of quality in the ideas of some, but this idea of democracy. That in an oral tradition, everyone has access. In an electronic tradition, almost everyone has access. Not everyone owns a computer, but most of us do. But in that space in between, from, about December 10th to December 31st, for those 20 days, literature, writing is not only a more elite enterprise for those of us who consume it, but also for the people who create it. There are limits. So the internet has changed things tremendously, and I know a little bit later in the symposium, Dr. Heider is going to talk about social and cultural implications of the printing press and the internet. I'm more interested in the aesthetic and artistic ones, but still in all, does art belong to everyone? And if one believes that art belongs to everyone and that everyone has it in them to produce art on some level, then we're right back where we started. And I think that's where I'm going to end. So I didn't hold up the pen the whole time, I suppose. But I will still argue that writing itself is probably the most significant technology that we've ever had. And this was just my little take on what it means in my field.
Thank you.
Very good.
Thank you.
Very well. Well, what makes the idea in my mind or on my mouth different than when it's written with a pen or documented, kind of?
When you're writing, you have more time to consider. And if you think about when you speak, particularly when we're talking about artistic production, say poetry, there's only so much you can hold in your brain at any given time. Whereas if you write something down, you write it down, and then you can go back to it, and it's still there in exactly the same form as when it came out and your hand wrote it down. And so that's the big difference, is this idea of being able to apply a different level of thought and analysis to what you're writing.
Is writing by any means a way of me seeing what I can't see in one snapshot in my mind? The term is my thoughts were racing, and they're coming to my mind, and I'm speaking. So when they speak, they're kind of getting out of the box, being in the box. I'm spreading them in front of me and seeing the line of 100 pages that I couldn't see in one instance in my mind. I mean, they are all in, but now they are spread. Is there anything to that?
I think so. Now, of course, we write much more slowly than we speak.
Yeah.
But we read much more quickly than we listen.
You're right.
So cognitively, I'm not quite sure what's going on there. I know there's a distinction, but I'm not quite sure how that's working.
So when I see my thoughts in front of me, I really come to know me more, know how I think more, right?
You do, because you can write something down when you're 16 and return to it when you're 40.
And look at yourself.
And look at who you were and who you are today, and that allows for a very different degree of reflection than if all we had to do was speak.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I started my question, but I mean, didn't ask you if anybody has questions. It's I mean, when you have the microphone, that's your privilege. Any other questions, if you like? We have the dean of the library with us. What would you say to that?
That's why I kept looking at him when I was saying anything about books.
No.
And he is writing notes. Did you notice? He was writing notes. He was writing
No,
notes.
you did very well.
Yeah. What would say you?
No, I enjoy this whole idea of the idea of elitism and projecting your thoughts, and only certain people get to speak in a former life of publishing, and turn the clock back 100 years or 30 years maybe, but I don't know that we're progressing very much by letting everyone fill up other people's time with things that are questionable, and certainly if they are not well researched, and they are pretending to be, that's a horrible thing to happen in culture, is that someone plants a seed that is already rotten and people follow up on it based on, well, I think they know what they're talking about, and the person who wrote it knew they didn't know what they were talking about.
Well, that is a difference between this electronic world and the oral world, because in the electronic world, it's all out there and it can stay out there as long as it wants. But in an oral tradition, of course, if it's not good, people are going to stop coming.
Right.
Right? If a poet is singing a poem that's really dull or offensive or any number of other things, he's not going to get paid. People aren't going to come the next night to hear him, and he's going to move on to another occupation, right? So there was a level of quality control, I think, in those traditional societies, and people had to learn how to do it, whereas now you can kind of just do pretty much whatever you want. The audience still is significant in that it, if it's not good, people won't be sharing it with other people to go see your website or read your work. But it doesn't go away. It's still there, unless someone actually takes it down.
Mm-hmm. Well, these experiments that people do sort of tongue-in-cheek in the laboratory or in the studio writing, and then they send them out, and people have been successful in making a mockery of the whole publishing industry by saying, I wrote this foolishness and 150
People
electronic works published it.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Go figure. But so I really don't like the games people play, although if you look back, these dime novels, I mean, a lot of those were just hack things that people put together, and you put a sexy cover on it and it sold. Didn't matter if they read it or not.
Right.
And so and a lot of remainders type books, over the several decades were synonymous with, no one wanted this, who thought this was going to be a good thing. But I like the idea that people can bring their thoughts forward. I just hope that they fully bake them before they or at least get them in the stove before they just stick it out there and see what happens.
And that's what I think it's interesting today in this day and age with all the technologies we have and all the access we have, just the definition of what is art anymore, right? If we're talking about literary art, but I was thinking, I mean, we can probably trace the exact same trajectory with music, right?
Of course.
There's all the traditional music, some of which is really quite good. And then when people started writing scores down, it's a different animal. And now,
Talk
of course,
about the elite. That really separated
Yes.
the,
absolutely, because not
amateurs
every,
from the
to get a
pros.
score published was a big deal. Now I can turn up my whatever it is on here, my e-guitar or whatever, and put something out with no knowledge whatsoever.
no.
And so it becomes more free, it becomes more alive, but at the same time, if we're looking at craftsmanship and quality, it doesn't get as much care as a written piece, whether it's a music piece or a literary piece.
Now, question regarding the audience or the receiver, receiving end. There are periods in certain cultures, actually all cultures, when for some reason or another things went down and the standard, the high standard was kind of different. So poets and musicians started to write to their audience, really. So
Yes.
when you look into the stratum of literature coming from that period, it's known by our contemporaries that it was so, the topics are not good, the content is not good, and everything was poor, kind of, because the listeners were poor. The king at the time was poor in mind or something, and this is what made him laugh. So people wrote to make him laugh. So it became the era's feature. How would you account for that?
Well, it seems like in every culture, we have these high points where it's a sort of a proliferation of really good art emerges. And it's usually tied in with the economy. It's often tied in with the leadership at the time, because some dictators, for example, can be very oppressive. And that too, you might have a lot of wealth, but if that wealth is not distributed well and the people are put down and the artists are censored, which we see a lot even today, it's much more difficult, right, to do that. But I think about the greatest of the Greek tragedies were written in a time when Greece was powerful and wealthy. And I find it ironic that the best of the art was about awful things in a time when a society was prosperous. Same thing happens in Elizabethan England. They were fairly prosperous, but Shakespeare is writing these just awful stories. I mean, not awful in terms of quality, but really heart-wrenching, tragic things. Now, he's writing comedies as well. But there's also a social distinction that tragedy tends to be more of a genre for the upper classes and comedy for the lower socioeconomic classes. And I think that makes a little sense, because if your life is miserable, you want to go somewhere and laugh, right? So that makes sense to me. But it is interesting how the socioeconomic status of a country or civilization, the way in which the production of art sort of ebbs and flows along with that.
Now, would you agree, and the question for both of you, if you like, that with somebody who said recently that we are living in dangerous times, quote unquote, meaning not only the receiving end of arts or production, whatever, written or movie or music, is accepting and demanding of the low quality of things. Again, you have to define what low quality is and high quality is, because to everybody it's different. But what the person saying or referring to dangerous is that Oxford dictionary, the one that was kind of classic, that says sets the standards for words and lexicons. They are changing the meanings of the words that have been honored for thousands of years, because the current consumers, quote unquote, don't understand it or don't agree to it.
Right.
So the majority says, for example, no, I don't like this concept. So they change the word that spoils the concept. So how about the kids are coming and reading go to the dictionary, that's what we all do, and find a misrepresenting word
for a concept because.
But language is alive.
Mm.
Language
Yeah.
is like any other organism, and
Okay.
so it always is going to change. And it's going to change through usage, through culture. If we think about things like in English, or if you take a basic grammatical issue of the times, who and whom, right? Hardly anyone knows how to use this appropriately anymore. And after a while, whom is just going to disappear.
Yeah.
And you can argue whether that's an evolution or a devolution of the language, but the word is just going to go away.
I really, or he was not pointing to thou, there, or thy, to change kind of thing. This is
Yeah.
something that's natural, that's alive.
And so in
But-
some, there may be, sort of one standardized spelling that means all three of those things in the future.
Exactly. Tough will change and love will change. And this is no problem here. The problem is when somebody comes to the cardinal directions, north, south, east, west, and the definition by definition, when you go to the dictionary, the north is. And because people didn't like that, I'm giving just an example here, they changed the north. So the
Yeah.
newer generation would take the north as something else, and they lose their direction. So it's not like thee and thou and think.
Right.
That's natural. But I'm talking about north would lose its meaning, and people will lose their awareness after this. So,
And I think that too is just part of the way language changes, and for some of us it's alive, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a betterment, right? It's changing, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's changing for the better.
yeah.
Although I think some people would argue. I mean, there are certain people who would define art and language and say that, change is good, we just have to embrace it and not worry about it. Even
Yeah.
though, a generation 100 years from now will have a very different interpretation of a concept than we do today. I can't think of examples off the top of my head about how this has happened in the past, but it certainly has. And
No, I mean, we never had somebody to change the cardinal directions, but
Right.
nowadays we have. That's why he said this is dangerous slope, let us awake.
Well,
And-
yeah, I mean, you could argue that we're actually, devolving. And part of this is driven by political forces.
Yes.
I
Economic enforcement.
I remember when I was in college, kind of a like example, maybe if we want to stick with the analogy of the cardinal directions, that in Latin American countries, they wanted to turn the map upside down.
They do that, yes.
Because for them,
Why are we at the bottom of?
right, and there was a value judgment about who was north and who was south, and who was at the top and who was at the bottom.
Even the center, I mean.
Right, or,
Africa,
a map. Do you put the United States in the middle of the map, which
Yes.
means you have to cut Asia in half?
See? Yeah. Why don't you cut the other way? Yes.
Right, or cut it in the middle of the ocean, which is the way it was before. So I think these same kinds of political movements and ideas and cultural perspectives work their way into language as well, and they're all a little bit different cases, I think. In some of these, I can see the point if you flip the map upside down. It's like, why are we on top? That I understand. But I would still want to call it north, even if it's down here
Yes,
rather than up
that's
here.
the norm. Yes, that's the point.
Right.
But if you, let me tell you something. So listen, in the class I come to talk to students, I usually bring a map and make the students make a circle. And I say, where's the top? So people always point to the top. And I tell them, is it upside down? Some students say it's weird, we have to do it this way.
Yeah.
But this is now we're talking about point of view, of location or something, or perspective. But the danger is when somebody comes to the dry land and say, no, this is water.
Right.
And this water, no, let's call it dry land.
Mhm.
Now, what are we doing?
Right. Well, and that's where I think science and technology and philosophy, those more analytical disciplines, are going to be the ones that preserve that interpretation more than necessarily the arts. Because one of the reasons for art is to upset the status quo, right? And so in artistic production, I'm not sure it is dangerous. It's going to be provocative, it's going to be challenging. But I do think that in other disciplines that depend more on that common understanding of something, that we'll still have a fair amount of stability there. But it's not something I've really thought too much about.
Well, it did.
I think it's interesting, though, something Bonnie said just a few sentences ago, talking about life 100 years from now, and technology is making major impact in how that, or those civilizations will look at what happened during our period, because we were at this sort of turning point of technology. You know, much of the correspondence has gone email, which will disappear. The dime novels that people are still studying and enjoying and looking at society from, you know, 100 years ago, that type of publication today will not, yes, it's probably digitized, but it will be thrown out before 100 years because no one has looked at it. You know, and so, and libraries aren't keeping all that either, you know, the fanzines and these little things that the dime novels were very close to that, at least in my estimation.
Yeah.
And it's like comic books, you know, she has a very sophisticated comic book here, and this will survive.
This one will,
because
yeah.
someone has paid attention to the content.
Right, right.
But many won't, and you know, we will go on. But you know, the things that we're losing in email preservation and in e-commerce and in many things are going to, you know, paint our generation as somewhat different than it actually was.
I think so.
Well, as it is with Bonnie Irwin, whenever she comes and leaves, she leaves people more inspired, more with more answers and more questions. So,
That's
and
such a-
I really appreciate you never turned down a request to share yourself and your knowledge with people. So, God bless you.
Good job.